Welcome to the podcast, The Next Big Thing. I'm your host, Keith D. Terry, a consultant, a coach, and a serial entrepreneur. Our guest today is Dr. Tessa Conroy, Associate Professor of Agriculture and Applied Economics. We'll be talking about the impact of applied economic research on life. Now, I say that because her work has profound impact on regional economic development. But before I introduce you to our guest, like I always do with all of my podcasts, I like to give a little bit of contextual information to help people understand the subject matter that we're going to be talking about. And this subject is not going to disappoint. You know, we're talking about applied economics. And, before we start, applied economics is used, is economic theory and principles used to solve real world problems and formulate policies. Now, Dr. Conroy is going to correct me if I am wrong, but a little bit more research I did, and I just want you to bear with me because I wrote my research here. Applied economic development, a field that is essential for understanding and improving the economic conditions of specific regions or sectors. Applied economic development involves practical strategies to stimulate economic growth, create jobs, and to improve overall economic health. You know, the history of this field is based on my research is happened over 4 key stages. The first one is in the early 19th century. During this period, economic development primarily focused on industrialization and physical infrastructure necessary to support growth, such as transportation and utilities. Governments began to recognize the need for policies to support their industrial and economic development. The second stage was post-World War II. This was a significant attention because there were some war-torn economies, especially in Europe and Japan. You know, the Marshall Plan, for instance, was an enormous economic development program by the U.S. to rebuild and revitalize Europe. This era also marked the beginning of formal economic development based on my research in some developing countries, often supported by the international organizations such as the World Bank. The third stage was in the late 20th century. Economic development during this period expanded to include not just infrastructure, industrial growth, but also social aspects such as education, health, welfare. The focus also shifted towards sustainable development, emphasizing a balanced approach of economic growth, environmental prevention, and social equity. Now, the last stage. Today, economic development is increasingly data-driven, and I'd like Dr. Conroy to correct me if I'm wrong on that, influenced by technological advances. Economic development professionals such as Dr. Conroy's economic analysis and research is used to inform policy decision makers, where they're focused on issues such as regional development, gender disparities in the labor market, and to have an overall economic impact. And so applied economic development can be used to identify effective strategies to boost the economy. That's what my research found. So let me now introduce Dr. Tessa Conroy. Dr. Tessa Conroy is an economic development specialist and the assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, my alma mater. Proud Badger I am. She works in the Department of Agriculture and Applied Economics and the Department of Extensions. She studies community economic growth and development, small business dynamics, and entrepreneurship. She has been recognized for her research, outreach, and teachings. Her research and commentary have appeared on outlets such as the Wall Street Journal, MarketWatch, the Wisconsin State Journal, Wisconsin Public Radio, PBS, and now this podcast, The Next Big Thing with Keith Terry. Of course, I had to give a self-plug on that one. Dr. Conroy, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be with you today.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's get into it. How did you, first, like I asked all of my guests, who are you? Where'd you come from? Tell us a little bit about you.
Sure. So I am an associate professor at UW, and I focus on regional economic development, as you mentioned. I am particularly interested in marginalized communities, and that can mean a lot of different things. In the past, that's meant rural audiences. I'm thinking about that more going forward. It has meant women, it has meant people of color. So these groups facing particular challenges, and that comes from who I am as a person. So I grew up in a rural setting. We had a lot of economic challenges. I was
Okay.
encouraged to think more about that through my studies, and it still influences my work today.
Now, Midwest is from you from, or do you go west or east, or where
I'm from,
exactly?
yeah, I'm from the Pacific Northwest. I'm from Goldendale, Washington. So it is the
Ah,
Golden Gate to the Evergreen State,
okay.
about an hour from anywhere.
Okay. Okay. Well, I know it well because I work for a company out that way. It's beautiful. It's
Yes,
beautiful.
yes, yes. Very.
So that helped to shape you because I guess my next question is how did you, meander your way into applied economics?
Yeah.
I would love to hear that journey.
I did meander, as you said. So it started again with my rural upbringing, and I grew up in a really small town. And our major employer, which was an aluminum plant, closed when I was in my teens, and that created a lot of hardship in our region. And my hometown has continued to struggle since the closure of that major employer, and I think that's the story of a lot of places.
Yeah.
It might not be aluminum, but it could be a timber company, it could be a paper plant. All of these different types of industries that have gone away have left a lot of rural places in particular hurting. And so seeing that growing up, I was really interested in inequality across place. So, my
Okay.
place is hurting, but other places are doing quite well. And then going to college encouraged to think more about inequality and not just about across places, but across people, by gender, by race, by ethnicity.
Mhm.
How do we understand issues of inequality? And then through graduate school, studying economics, that really gave me a toolkit, a
Yeah.
quantitative toolkit for
Right.
analyzing those differences and starting to think about the intersection between inequality and economic development. So when we think about how do we help a place, how do we create a stronger region, how do we help people in a community reach their goals, sometimes looking at inequality and seeing if we can do better is part of the answer to that question. And
Okay.
so when we can support small business owners who are underrepresented, whether that's women, a lot of my work is focused on women business
Okay.
owners, or business owners of color, and
Yeah.
we have entrepreneurs reaching their full potential. That's good for everybody.
It
Entrepreneurship generates
absolutely is.
jobs. Entrepreneurship generates income. It alleviates poverty. It creates economic stability. So for all of those reasons, we want to be thinking about supporting entrepreneurship in an inclusive way.
Okay, so in my introduction, when I was talking about the stages, did I get it right? How government, because there is a connection between what you do at a university and the powerful thinking that's there and what government, either state government or federal government wants. And do I have that incorrect? Do I have the stages
I mean, I
correct?
think ideally that is, the case. I think that you gave a really great overview of how the discipline has evolved over time, and this relationship between what we're learning about in economics and how that manifests in terms of policy. One thing I would add to the discussion is I think where we're headed now is a conversation not just about, okay, well, what is applied economics teaching us about economic growth? We're really headed in a direction of quality of life. It's not just about jobs and income. It is also about well-being, and we're thinking about that in a more comprehensive way. So it's people's satisfaction, it's quality of life, it's amenities, it's jobs and income, but it's also green space in the environment and health and all of these things that make a place a really nice community to live in.
Well, what's interesting about that. So peeling back the onion, I love that it's about quality of life. Is that because of how you great professors are thinking and you're trying to influence policymakers, or are policymakers thinking about these questions?
Yeah, I mean, I like to think it's a two-way street, right? That at least in applied economics, the way I work on it with my team, we're always talking about the two-way street, or this kind of virtuous cycle, if you will, or that's what we strive for, that we're doing research, we're trying to see what's on the horizon, we're trying to understand what communities are working on, thinking about, struggling with, succeeding in doing, and provide them more information to support informed decision making. But we're also doing a lot of listening and getting information about what's happening, what are the problems, what do you need to know more about to be successful, and that's informing the research. So, we're helping them see what's on the horizon and hopefully deliver kind of the latest and greatest in any topic area. And they're telling us, this is what's important, this is what we're worried about, this is what's working, can you tell us more? And so in this sort of two-way conversation, we hope that one is influencing the other.
Yeah, you hope. Because whenever we talk about policymakers, we're talking about lawmakers, right? Mm-hmm. And I wonder if they're listening. But, at the end of the day, when I think across states, I think about states, you just hope that they're listening. And so I guess to peel back the onion a little bit more, so how do you define practical and actionable knowledge in the context of regional development? Because I'm looking at how your data is applied, but it starts with how you guys are thinking about it. Mm-hmm. And, when you start thinking about gender equity, mm-hmm. which is something you said you're passionate about, mm-hmm. or when you start thinking about people of color, mm-hmm. There's a political environment that shifts things, mm-hmm. but those questions are still very pertinent. So how do you think about those two topics, gender equity and people of color, in mm-hmm. the context of your research and data? Sure. How do you do that?
So you started by asking, how do you define kind of practical and actionable knowledge? Yeah. And for me, the answer is pretty simple. This is, it because it gets used. People are using it to make policy. They're using it to inform their conversations. They're using it to develop strategies. They're using it to learn about a problem or challenge. And I think that is the hallmark, that's what I want for my research. That's how I feel I've done well on a topic, is that people are talking about it and using it. And so when we're thinking about gender equity and people of color, this can happen a couple of different ways. So one of the more recent areas of focus for me when it comes to gender inequality is about childcare, and how important childcare is for women's labor force participation, how important it is for wage equity, and these sorts of things. So when I get to have a conversation with a policymaker about, is childcare important? Should we put this at the top of our list? Why would we, want to develop a strategy or legislate around this? We can talk about, here's why. We are in kind of the midst of a labor shortage. If we want to see more people enter the workforce, we might want to be thinking about women, and to what extent women are limited in their participation because of childcare responsibilities, and how a childcare policy could help alleviate that constraint, for example. So that's one way we might approach it. When it comes to people of color, an example might be to say, we want to invest in business owners of color in our state. What might be the most effective way to do that? And when we go look at the data, and I can talk about this in more detail, but we see that business owners of color, for example, are much more likely to own businesses that don't have any paid employees, that they're these sort of one man and one woman shops. Yeah. And
truly small business.
Yes, micro businesses. And we could easily maybe dismiss those as those are too small to be economically important. And I would encourage anyone to reevaluate that, because 75% of businesses in the US are these one man and one woman shops. All of these people are creating jobs for themselves. 25% of them intend to hire employees. So they're also this really important seedbed for future employers. And yet a lot of programs are biased towards jobs. We want job growth. We want more jobs. We want, we want to count the people that are going to work. Yeah. And that biases us away, I think, from thinking about micro businesses and investing in them. So focusing on small businesses is also a great way to focus on people of color and grow the economy through that segment of our business community.
That's interesting. I'm glad you said what you said, because I think people do. The light bulb just went off with me, and you see the job growth indicators that come out every
Yes.
month. They're talking about job growth, and I wonder if in that statistic you have the 500 jobs that opened by one person.
Yeah.
Based on what I'm hearing you say, it doesn't include those people.
So, right, if you only employ, if you're only working for yourself, right, you have to be paying payroll taxes. That's how it's going to show up in those numbers. So if you don't have payroll employees that you're paying payroll taxes for, then that wouldn't count. So for most kind of sole proprietors, one man, one woman shop, they wouldn't be included.
Okay. So now you have a team of people. You are an expert, applied economic expert.
Mm-hmm.
When you guys are thinking about your research, it's the chicken and the egg. Does the government come to you first, or do you guys think of things? Tell me about how you decide what research you're going to initiate.
Yeah. Oftentimes in my experience working, it's been a really nice dovetailing of interests, to be honest. We've been fortunate in that way. So for example, in Wisconsin, we've known that broadband accessibility is a challenge. And so my team, had been talking about what can we do to focus on this. We can do these mapping exercises. We can create fact sheets. We can run some webinars. But then the pandemic hit, and it was reprioritization. Like, this is top of mind now. Connectivity is the central focus of a lot of people's lives, quite frankly, of course, our health, but in order to access our education, our work, and even entertainment and kind of stay sane, to stay in relationship with our families, a lot of that had to do with connectivity. And if you don't have broadband internet, that's really, really challenging. And so this problem that had been simmering was now at the top of mind. And we need to understand better what the limitations are. So we need to know what is available in Wisconsin. We need to know what the technologies are. For people that are just joining the conversations, they might need education on why this is important. So what are the economic benefits? What are the health benefits? What are the education benefits? And so we can play a role through research in helping people understand, okay, this is why broadband is important. This is why it's a worthy investment. And then once they're on board in terms of thinking about prioritizing internet access, then we can provide also through extension, University of Wisconsin Extension, we have a team focused on broadband, providing a lot of technical assistance right now so that communities can form their plans and access those federal funds that have become available. And so now we work with our Public Service Commission. We have great partnerships between, our state level agencies and what my colleagues are trying to do on broadband. And I have to really kind of tip my hat to my colleagues because they've taken the lead on this at this point now, 4 years out of the pandemic. But it's been, in my mind, a great example of researchers coming together with people who are delivering programs, with state officials, all to make progress on a challenge that's in a lot of communities.
And so once the research is produced,
Mm-hmm.
do you just put it on the shelf? How do you, how do people find out about it? Because I just want to make the connection. I was thinking that it was paid for by either state government or federal government, and it could be.
It could be. We have grant support at the state and federal level that certainly helps support our work. And I should have integrated that into my answer as well, that oftentimes there's a call for, applications to do research, and there's funding available to support it. And so, for example, some of our work focused on rural Wisconsin is grant supported at the state and federal level. And so we're able to, take something that we've been working on for a while and really expand and grow that work because we have investment from government entities.
And so I love that, because it's now paid for, it's been drafted, you've structured, and now it's been executed, and you've produced a piece of material. Mm-hmm. Does it always end in policy changes or law?
No, certainly not. I mean, we hope so. We hope to be part of the conversation. But you never know, to some extent, when you start a project, you don't always know if it's going to hit. So we've done work on broadband that I mentioned that
Okay.
really took off and has formed a great partnership and a lot of activity. And we've been able to work with a variety of other organizations and support communities, for example, and that's been going on for years. But we also have done reports on other topics that sometimes they do sit, but sometimes we circle back, right?
I see.
So, when I first came to Wisconsin, if it would be 8 or 10 years ago now, we did some work on women business owners, and it didn't get as much attention maybe compared to like the broadband work, for example.
Yeah.
But that women business owner work has grown into women's labor force work, which has become really relevant in the context of a labor shortage. So even though it's been some time, the work grows, the issues change, and it's still relevant, and we get to come back to it and use it in a different way. So we're still having these conversations now based on work we've maybe done, a few years ago.
Well, I certainly wasn't suggesting that it's a failed data if it doesn't end up in policy or law. Not at all. I think quite honestly, the data is very rich. I don't know if people, I think people should look at your work because it's really enlightening.
I appreciate that.
And so I thought I turned my phone off. So as we if we pick one of them, and let's talk about the people of color, were there some surprises in that research?
Yeah.
So that people understand, she produced 2 pieces. Why don't you describe the work? You could do it much more better, but you could do it better than I can.
Sure. So I've been working with a student, Mary McDermott. So she's our lead author on the project, and a geographer here at UW, Matthew Curis. And together we produced a report and policy brief on business owners of color in Wisconsin. The report is meant to give the lay of the land in terms of what are the trends and outcomes for business owners of color in Wisconsin. And the policy brief is meant to discuss strategies for growth. And in terms of what's surprising, this won't surprise everyone, but it might surprise some people that, this is a huge community in Wisconsin. We have close to 50,000 businesses owned by people of color, employing 55,000 workers, generating $1.6 billion in payroll. And we take an economic lens to this question. So when we write these reports and policy briefs, we're thinking, okay, what should people support in terms of economic development? Why should they support it? And how should they support it? And so in answering that what should they support question, I think that answer is easy. Well, we have tens of thousands of businesses that are worthy of investment. They're generating a lot of economic activity, have a significant economic presence, and are really important to the state's economy. So that's one answer to that question. When we go into why should we support these businesses, now we want to think about why. The why is that we're seeing in the data challenges for these business owners. So there is an issue of underrepresentation in the state. Mm-hmm. There is an issue of underperformance in the state compared to non-minority owned businesses.
Yes.
And so that's an opportunity. I mean, it's frustrating, but it's also an opportunity because if business owners of color were operating in parity to their white owned counterparts, it would be thousands of businesses more in Wisconsin. It would be thousands of jobs more in the state. And that's good for everybody. When the economy is doing well, when our entrepreneurs are doing well, it benefits the individual business owner, certainly, but it also benefits the broader economy. And I think that's the why we should support it. We want these business owners reaching their full potential for their own benefit and for the benefit of a strong, robust state economy. And to be honest, it's only going to become more important going forward. Our populations are diversifying. When we look by age cohort, younger generations are more diverse than older generations. The country is aging. Our state of Wisconsin is aging. So when we think about what do young people want? Where do they want to go? Where do they want to live? How do we recruit them and attract them to our communities? they might be thinking about, well, where do I want to start my business? How, what are the places that I can go where I'm going to be successful as a business owner? And it's all connected to economic development.
That's interesting. Do you find that your data is, and I don't know how to shape this question, is it creating trends or following the trends? I would love to hear your response to that.
Yeah, I would say we're definitely identifying trends. We can only manage what we can measure, and we want to see what the trends are. So, for example, pre-pandemic, we saw this really dramatic growth period for businesses owners of color, and we want to amplify that and hopefully, promote that trend going forward. So, what can we do to encourage that in the years to come? We know it existed. We know that the pandemic created a lot of hardship. So how do we invest in our entrepreneurs and our business owners to recreate growth that we saw in previous decades in this new kind of modern contemporary context?
Okay. And so if we were to now look at the gender research you did, similar findings there?
Yeah. So the findings for women-owned businesses, I would say, are different, or the same but different, right? It's a very economist answer. So the same but different. And what I mean by that is that we have seen dramatic growth of women-owned businesses, but not quite as dramatic as we saw for people of color. Mm-hmm. And so there is evidence of challenges for women business owners, particularly in the last 2 decades. So there was a lot of growth for women in the economy in the 70s and 80s, and then it started to trail off in the 90s and 2000s. And so this progress that we saw in terms of gender equity seems to have lost pace, lost momentum in recent decades. I think childcare is part of the reason for that. It's gotten very expensive and very difficult oftentimes for it to make financial sense for women to work, whether it's as an employee or as owner of their own business, and really focus on the growth and development. And for some women, that's a choice. For someone, they're juggling childcare and employment in one form or the other. But there are some who might prefer to focus on their business and have childcare be part of that equation. And so different but the same in that I think that there are challenges, there are opportunities for growth, but the flavor of the challenge might be a little bit different. The specifics of the growth patterns are going to be a little bit variant across these different audiences.
I bet it is. But I bet it's also rewarding. So just one question on the methodology of collecting this data. Is it an arduous process? Can you just elaborate on that a little bit, on how difficult it is to get this data?
We're fortunate. So we have several good data sources available to us. So part of that is through the U.S. Census Bureau. So they're doing a lot of data collection for us, using tax information to create data sets about businesses at the state, county, metropolitan level. It's harder to do rural areas just because there are fewer businesses. We run into data suppression, particularly for people of color, that there are just very small numbers of them. And so to protect the identity of these business owners, that data might get suppressed or withheld. That, if we release it, somebody's going to be able to know that, that one person is owned, or that one business is owned by that one person, and now we have all of their financial information. So it's just harder in rural areas because of thinner markets. Right. But there are some also, in addition to the government data sets, proprietary data sets that we've been able to gain access to. And there are just kind of different rules about what can be shared. We do our best to anonymize, but they can be a little bit more detailed in terms of what's out there. We've also started to do, it's not out yet, but our own primary data collection through survey work. That's definitely very time intensive. I am dabbling for the first time in generating surveys and collecting original data, and to put together an effective survey, we want to be really thoughtful about how we do that, the resources used, the information that we collect from people, and then how that's shared back. So depending on the data source, it ranges from very easy to access to very difficult to collect. And then we also are juggling a range of pros and cons with each data set, right? Each data set is going to have strengths and weaknesses in terms of the detail that's available. Maybe as a trade-off with timeliness, for example. So it's really detailed, but we can only get data that's, 2, 3, 4, maybe even 5 years old.
Now that's interesting. Are there data sets that you don't use because you don't feel that the confidence factor is high enough?
There are examples of that. So there are times, for example, where we are comparing a data set against the census and comparing like employment numbers, for example. And we find that, this data set looks really good when we're trying to evaluate the number of businesses and maybe who owns them, but these employment numbers aren't making sense, for example. So we do try to investigate the quality of data when we're using it and understand those strengths and weaknesses before we share it with audiences.
I see. And so now let's move. I have one interesting question for you. You've finished this. How do you interact with the lawmakers or the policymakers? I mean, is there a gold standard that you use, or is there a process that you use? I'm interested because I don't know how your data is used, and I think the listening public would love to know.
Yeah, I would say there's always a relational component, right, of how we learn. And I think that's true even in my work as a researcher, that when we're in relationship with our students, with our teachers, that we learn more effectively. And so oftentimes when we think about state agencies or elected officials, that we want to have a relationship with these people so that we're always in conversation and we're sharing what we learn, and they're sharing with us what's important, what's on the top of their desk as well. And so when we do produce something, we like to first just share it broadly, maybe a direct email, but that can also be webinars. We love to be invited to talk to a group of people or an audience or a room full of people, whoever will listen. And we're always excited to share what we're finding. So sometimes it's a really direct contact. Sometimes it's just a broader educational activity. Sometimes it's being on the radio. Sometimes it's doing a podcast. However we can put it out there so that it can be part of public discourse and people can pick it up and have conversations amongst themselves or with us about how to use the information. That's, I think, the name of the game. We want more informed decisions. And in our case, with this Business Owners of Color report and with some of our rural work, we're fortunate to have a close relationship with the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation. They're very interested in working in these spaces. And so they're wanting real-time updates. We're learning from them what their programs are out in the state, what issues they're seeing. They're doing listening sessions. And so we can have really robust relationships sometimes. And we just keep kind of putting out what we're learning for it to be used by, hopefully by policymakers for the better of our communities.
I hope so, because, now that let's talk a little bit about your data a little bit more. The people of color research, was that a question that came out of the Economic Development Corporation, or how did the question come up?
Both. So that was a really nice, I used the word dovetailing. It was like serendipitous of our team was talking about, we want to prioritize some work on business owners of color in the state. And at the same time, in our conversations with the Economic Development Corporation saying, we're starting to focus more on this. We're growing some programs. Can you provide us data or provide us any information about what we need to know in the state? And we can say, yes, we'd love to do that. And we can continue to better understand each other's work.
Well, I think you're going to get a lot of your data was rich because I think there was a report that came out not too long ago that talked about the people of color and how they're faring in Wisconsin compared to others, and it wasn't so good. Mm-hmm. And we just hope, given this political environment, and I don't want to ask you a politics question, but I just hope that the data is used to make it better, because if you have more people working, you have more taxes being paid. Mm-hmm. And I know that's where your heart is. And so let's talk a little bit about the second report, which was more solutions. And I thought you came up with some really great ones. And there were three areas, and is funding and finances, supply chain diversification, education, and mentorship. Do I have that correct?
You do.
And so how did you guys come up with the solutions? Because I thought it was kind of enlightening. It was true. It was, so how did you guys come up with those?
Yeah, I'm glad that to hear that resonated with you, especially as a business owner. I'm especially glad to hear that resonated with you. So we really try to offer solutions that are evidence-based. So we're looking at case studies, we're looking at research, not just our own. We're looking at what others have done in this area and trying to identify what works. And I should back up a step and say, the first step is really identifying what the problems are. So when it comes to business owners of color, we were looking for key themes to be thinking about. And sometimes that's really obvious, but we also want to be able to quantify it and show it with data. So access to capital, always a challenge with entrepreneurs, especially acute with business owners of color. I think the sectoral distribution of business owners of color is an issue. So the industries they're working in, we tend to see business owners of color working in lower sales sectors and earning lower than average sales. And
now,
so
explain that
for the
public a little bit more clearly.
That's a mouthful. So what I mean by that is that business owners of color are more likely to be working in services, for example. And a lot of service industries just aren't going to have the earning potential that like manufacturing does, for example, or wholesale trade. And so we're not going to see those like big returns that we would for this community of business owners the way we would for non-minority business owners. And so what could we do to diversify the industries that people of color work in? How can we make manufacturing, for example, more accessible? Or how can we make the information sector more accessible? And that's where I think the education and mentorship component comes in part. But this is also a story about capital constraints, right? So if you can't access the necessary capital to get into a sector like manufacturing, you're going to be diverted away into these other sectors with low barriers to entry. They're going to have low sales. You're not going to have the access to wealth accumulation that you would in some of these other sectors. And so the cycle perpetuates. And so all of this is connected. We choose these sectors with lower barriers to entry. They're going to earn lower sales over time. The businesses are going to be smaller. That oftentimes means they're going to be less resilient to economic downturns, so more challenged when we go into something like a pandemic. And these it's a perfect storm of challenges. It's going to keep business owners from reaching their full potential. And so one of the things we talk about in the policy brief is yes, funding and financing, yes, education and mentorship, yes, supply chain diversification, but these strategies tend to work best probably in tandem, right? When we're addressing multiple bottlenecks at the same time, because we could address one for a business owner just to bump up against the other, right? And so we need to be relaxing constraints across all of their activities as a business owner so that they can truly thrive. I can give some examples, but you look like you have a question.
No, please do. Yeah. Please do.
Yeah, so with funding and financing, one of the things that we considered and talked about was expanding the role of community development financial institutions. So this is a lot like a bank or a credit union, but they tend to have a stronger audience with business owners of color or with people of color in general. And so that tends to be a better or more effective way to reach this community with funding. So CDFIs, we don't have many of them compared to banks, more in the Midwest and other regions, but that would be one opportunity that could happen at like the state or federal level. When we think about supply chain diversification, this one is interesting to me because it's not necessarily something that has to be a state or federal policy. This is something an individual business owner could do, is just to say, hey, I'm looking at my procurement policies, I'm looking at my suppliers, and I would like to prioritize finding other businesses owned by people of color. There are databases to do that, but there are also informal networking events and ways to do that. So that's another way to support and support the success of business owners of color. And then when we think about education and mentorship, a number of opportunities come to mind. One is just making sure that young people see entrepreneurship particularly young people of color, see entrepreneurship as a viable career path? Like, are we talking about it in high schools as a potential career or job pathway in the same way that we are other professions, and setting up the tools that are needed for success in that area? Are our business
did you
owners,
guys do any comparative studies by state? Did you compare the outcome in Wisconsin to Illinois or California or other places?
We did on some big picture metrics. So just looking at the number of business owners of color, for example, and looking at some growth patterns and comparing by state in that sense. Getting into some of these like detailed comparisons in terms of lending and supply chain diversification, for example, the data it is really limited.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And so now that this is out there, and we could take any of them, are companies coming to you to get this data? Because I will tell you how I found your material, since I'm a podcaster and I'm an alumni, pretty important person in Milwaukee. I had him on the show and we were talking, and I said I wanted to get some guests, and I wanted to talk about the economic development in the state. And a couple of weeks later, he sent me your material, and that's when I reached out. And so it's quite interesting. I didn't know it was there. It's quite insightful, and quite honestly, this is not the People of Color Report is not the only thing you're working on. You're working on a whole, suite of ideas and topics. And so are community groups aware of the research that you guys have, and what's the outreach there?
I hope so. I mean, so we have, for a listserv, we're sharing these products via email with thousands of our contacts. We're putting them on the radio. So oftentimes Wisconsin Public Radio has been generous in sharing our work and taken an interest. So that's one way. We offer a number of webinars and lunch and learns that are open to everyone. But this is part of our challenges, just how do we best share our work with those who are interested and to those for whom it could be useful.
And so, I don't want to run out of time here. And so, moving forward, how long does it take you to complete this analysis? Because what I didn't see in your work, and I bet you guys are working on it, is AI. AI is a storm coming. Technology is a storm coming. Have you guys addressed those kinds of topical kinds of conversations?
A little bit. My colleagues have been thinking about automation, and I would, say AI is adjacent to that. So it's definitely under the umbrella of topics that we're thinking about. That said, sometimes research takes a really long time. We want to be thorough. We're juggling multiple projects. And so with the example of the Business Owners of Color report, and we're also working with students, and so we're sensitive to their, coursework and that sort of thing. I probably sound like I'm making excuses, but this is, a long way of saying that research can take years from the time we start talking about an idea to the time we're putting publications out. That said, we can always share work in progress. We always want to be in conversation so that whatever's happening is informing our research. We want to be up to date. We want AI to be entering into the things we're thinking about for the work that we're doing now. And so it's an ongoing process.
And so my final question is, you produced the People of Color report and, you have seen the political climate change, some laws change. Do you think, and this is going to be you looking in a crystal ball, given that we have a shift going on in this country politically, do you think there will be an appetite for the demographic work that you've done that's so important going forward? Will the funding sources dry up, or do you think they'll become more of them?
I'm optimistic that interest in these topics will only grow. Maybe that's very self-serving of me to say, but it's only going to become more important. The demographic shifts aren't going away. The country's becoming more diverse. Business ownership is becoming more diverse. I was looking at some statistics as an example that we have, I think it was something like 8 million businesses that we expect to change hands in the next 5 to 10 years as the baby boomers retire and maybe want to sell their business to the next generation. And younger business owners, the people who are buying, look a lot different than the people who are selling. And so the demographic shifts, the cultural changes, these are only going to become more relevant to our business development and economic development conversations going forward. And so I hope that the appetite only grows for the work that we're doing, because we enjoy doing it and want to be at the table, again, informing decisions to the best that we can.
And quite honestly, I don't see why it would go away, because you're right. The United States is changing. The world is changing. There's so many interesting things, and when in doubt, let the numbers lead you, is what I always like to say. So with that, Dr. Conroy, we could talk for a lot longer than we are. How do people reach you or find not so much reach you, but how do they find your material? Is there a place you'd like to tell folks to go and visit?
Sure. So again, I am with the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm in the Department of Extension. So our extension website on community economic development, so Madison Community Economic Development, you'll be able to find all of our reports just with a Google search. Of course, you can always reach me by email, and I'm happy to share them that way as well.
Well, Dr. Conroy, thank you so much for being on The Next Big Thing with Keith Terry. I thank you so much for your time, and welcome back. And yesterday was your first day back?
First day back.
She just had, well, I won't tell you business, but she's a mom. And so thank you guys, and you have a great day.
Thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure.
Okay, bye now. Thanks for listening to The Next Big Thing. I'm your host, Keith D. Terry. If you've enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support this podcast, please share it with others. Post about it on social media or leave a rating and a review. To catch all the latest from me, you can follow me on my YouTube channel at Keith D. Terry. If you want to recommend a guest, please email me at info@terryperformancegroup.com. This has been produced by your host and Jade Productions.